I came home from a business trip to find my backyard pool nearly empty, a garden hose still snaking over my fence toward the community amenity area 2 lots down, and my water bill, when it arrived 3 weeks later, showing over 11,000 gallons consumed in a single 48-hour window while I'd been out of state. All of it, as I would soon confirm, quietly siphoned out of my private pool and pumped directly into the community pool's basin, which had developed a persistent leak that our HOA board had apparently decided was cheaper to solve by draining my water than by actually fixing. My name is Bartholomew Echterberg de Lacroix. I live in Ridgemont Hollow, a community of about 200 homes, on a lot that happens to sit directly adjacent to the community's shared amenity area, a detail that, until this story, I had always considered a pleasant convenience rather than a liability. My pool is entirely private, built and paid for by my own funds 5 years ago, supplied through my own dedicated water line, and metered separately from any HOA shared infrastructure. A distinction I want to establish clearly because it turned out to matter enormously for everything that followed. The community pool, meanwhile, had been dealing with a persistent leak for months before this story starts, something I was vaguely aware of through neighborhood conversation, but hadn't paid particularly close attention to, since it wasn't a facility I personally used much, preferring the privacy of my own backyard pool for the exact reasons most people install one in the first place. The woman responsible for what happened is named Priscilla Wexler-Rashcombe, president of the Ridgemont Hollow board for about a year and a half by that point. I want to walk you through the financial context that apparently drove her decision, because understanding it matters for how absurd and, frankly, how easily avoidable this entire situation actually was. The community pool's leak, according to a contractor estimate the board had obtained about 2 months before my trip, would cost approximately $6,000 to properly diagnose and repair, an expense that Priscilla, according to what I later learned from a sympathetic board member, had been reluctant to bring to the membership as a special assessment, worried it would reflect poorly on her financial stewardship during an already contentious budget cycle. What Priscilla apparently decided instead, sometime while I was traveling for a 2-week business trip, was that rather than properly repairing the leak or approving the straightforward cost of simply refilling the pool through the community's own metered water connection, the cheapest and least visible solution was to quietly tap into my private pool's water, using my own dedicated line as an unauthorized source. Running a hose over the shared fence line between our properties and pumping enough water to keep the community pool at operational levels, while the actual leak repair kept getting deferred to some vague future budget cycle. I want to tell you about discovering this, because it took me longer than it probably should have to fully understand what had happened. I came home from my trip to find my pool's water level noticeably lower than I'd left it, my first assumption being ordinary evaporation over the 2-week absence, a plausible enough explanation during a particularly hot stretch of summer that I didn't think much of it initially. It was only when my water bill arrived 3 weeks later, showing a spike in consumption that made absolutely no sense given that I'd been out of state for half that billing period, that I started actually investigating. I called my water utility provider directly, requesting a detailed consumption log for the billing period in question, and what came back showed exactly what I described at the beginning of this story: a massive, concentrated surge of water usage, over 11,000 gallons, occurring within a tight 48-hour window that aligned precisely with the second week of my trip, water that, as far as any normal household usage pattern could explain, had no legitimate destination within my own property at all, since nobody had been home to use it for anything. I want to introduce you to my neighbor, Farah Nkemelu Whitfield, who lives on the opposite side of my property from the community pool area, and happened to mention, during a casual conversation at our shared mailbox cluster about a week after I'd started investigating my water bill, that she'd noticed a hose running along the fence line near the community pool during roughly that same window. Something she'd assumed at the time was simply routine pool maintenance and hadn't thought twice about. That detail was enough to send me directly to my own backyard to actually inspect my pool's plumbing and fence line myself. And what I found, examining the area near my pool's equipment pad, confirmed exactly what I'd started to suspect. A section of hose, matching the description Farah had given me, was coiled and tucked behind a storage shed near my own pool equipment, clearly having been connected, at some point during my absence, directly to my pool's drainage valve, run over the shared fence, and used to funnel water directly into the community pool's basin. I want to walk you through the conversation I had with Priscilla once I confronted her directly with this discovery, because her response, delivered with a calm confidence that genuinely stunned me given what she was actually admitting to, revealed exactly how casually she'd approached the entire decision. She confirmed, without much hesitation once I described what I'd found, that the board had authorized transferring water from my pool to address the community pool's leak issue, characterizing it as a temporary, cost-effective solution, while the board continued evaluating permanent repair options, and stated that she hadn't anticipated I would object so strongly given that, in her words, it was just water. I want to sit with that phrase for a moment, because it captures something important about the entire mindset that led to this situation. Just water. 11,000 gallons of water that I had personally paid to fill my own private pool with, siphoned out without my knowledge or consent while I was hundreds of miles away, treated by the person responsible as a resource so trivial that its unauthorized use barely warranted an apology, let alone any real acknowledgement that what had actually happened constituted, at minimum, a genuine trespass onto my private property and theft of a resource I had exclusively paid for. I called a friend of mine, an attorney named Desmond Okonkwo Ferreira who specializes in property disputes, and described the entire situation: the drained pool, the water bill spike, the hose I'd found, and Priscilla's own admission that the board had authorized this. Desmond's response was immediate and, honestly, somewhat gleeful in a way that told me he recognized exactly how strong a position I was actually in. "Bartholomew," he said, "I want you to understand what you're actually describing here, because I don't think Priscilla fully grasped it when she made this decision. This isn't a landscaping dispute or a fee disagreement. This is unauthorized entry onto your private property, tampering with your private pool equipment, and the theft of a metered utility resource that you exclusively paid for, all committed specifically while you were away and unable to object. Depending on how your state's specific trespass and conversion statutes are written, and I suspect they're written fairly favorably for exactly this situation, this could be both a serious civil claim and, frankly, a matter worth reporting to local law enforcement as well, given that what happened here genuinely does meet the basic elements of criminal trespass and theft, regardless of how casually the board seems to be treating it." What Desmond and I did next, and what we discovered about exactly how the HOA had planned to handle their own separate water supply obligations to the community pool going forward, a discovery that would end up giving me leverage considerably more powerful and immediate than any lawsuit could provide, is the reason this story ends with me making a decision that Priscilla never saw coming, one that brought the entire community pool's operation to an abrupt, humbling halt until she was forced to make things right. Desmond's first move was pulling the full utility infrastructure records for both my property and the community pool area, a request he filed with the water utility, and separately, with the county recorder's office to review any easements affecting my lot. What he found, within about a week, revealed something neither of us had anticipated, and it turned out to be the single most important discovery in this entire dispute. The community pool's own dedicated water supply line, the actual official metered connection that was supposed to service its refill and maintenance needs, ran underground through a utility easement that crossed directly through the back corner of my property, a detail that had existed since the community was first developed, but that I, like most homeowners, had never paid much attention to, since it had simply always functioned quietly underground without ever requiring any action on my part. What made this discovery critical was the specific language of the easement agreement itself, filed with the county when Ridgemont Hollow was originally platted. The easement granted the HOA a right of access to run and maintain that water line through my property, but included a provision, fairly standard in older utility easements, but one that Desmond told me he rarely sees anyone actually think to invoke, requiring the association to maintain the line in good working order, and explicitly stating that the easement's continued validity was conditioned on the HOA's good faith and lawful use of the granted access, with a clause allowing the underlying property owner to petition for termination of the easement if the association's use of it violated applicable law or caused demonstrable harm to the servient property. This is remarkable, Desmond told me, spreading the easement document across his desk. The community pool's actual legitimate water supply runs through your land, under an agreement that requires the HOA to use that access lawfully and in good faith. They just committed trespass and theft against you, using your own private pool as an unauthorized backup water source instead of properly maintaining the very line that runs through your property to serve that pool legitimately. I think we have a very strong argument that their conduct here constitutes exactly the kind of bad faith violation this termination clause was designed to address. I want to walk you through what this actually meant practically, because it took me a moment to fully process the leverage it gave us. If Desmond successfully petitioned to terminate the easement based on the HOA's demonstrated bad faith use of it, and the underlying agreement genuinely supported that argument given the clear language requiring lawful, good faith use as a condition of the grant, the community pool would lose access to its own legitimate water supply line entirely. The exact line that ran through my property, and that Priscilla's board had apparently decided, was less convenient to properly maintain than simply stealing water from my private pool instead. Desmond filed a formal petition with the county, citing the easement-specific conditional language, along with a detailed account of the unauthorized water diversion from my pool, my property's water utility consumption records confirming the exact volume and timing, and Priscilla's own admission, which I had, fortunately, gotten in writing through a follow-up email exchange where she'd reiterated her, just water, characterization of the situation, providing exactly the kind of documented bad faith the termination clause required. I want to tell you about the letter Desmond sent to the HOA board, separate from the formal county petition, informing them directly that given the demonstrated bad faith use of the easement, and pending the county's formal review of our termination petition, I was exercising what our easement review had confirmed was my right, as the underlying property owner, to restrict access to the easement area for any non-essential maintenance activity while the dispute remained unresolved. A decision that, practically speaking, meant the community pool's dedicated water line access through my property was, for the time being, effectively unavailable. I want to be honest about the satisfaction I felt sending that letter, because I understand it might read, to some people, as a disproportionate response to what started as a dispute over a single pool's worth of water. But I want you to understand what this actually accomplished, beyond simple retaliation. It meant that the community pool, already dealing with an unrepaired leak that had prompted this entire mess in the first place, now also lacked any legitimate means of refilling itself at all, since the same board that had decided stealing from my private pool was easier than properly maintaining their own infrastructure now found themselves with no working water access whatsoever, forced to confront the actual underlying leak repair they'd been avoiding for months. The community pool sat empty for 11 days, a fact that, I want to tell you, generated considerably more community attention and pressure on Priscilla than my own individual complaint about a drained backyard pool ever had. Since an empty community amenity during peak summer season affected considerably more households directly than a dispute most residents initially assumed was a private matter between me and the board. I want to walk you through how this finally resolved, because the pressure from an entire community suddenly without pool access, combined with the formal easement termination petition working its way through the county process, brought Priscilla to the negotiating table considerably faster than I think she initially expected. Desmond and I met with the board and their attorney about 2 weeks after the pool went dry, and I want to tell you, the tenor of that meeting was considerably different from Priscilla's initial dismissive. It was just water response weeks earlier. The settlement we reached required the HOA to fully fund the actual leak repair, the same $6,000 contractor estimate Priscilla had originally tried to avoid bringing to the membership, along with full compensation for my own water bill overage, and a formal, written acknowledgement of the unauthorized trespass and water diversion. In exchange, and only once the leak repair was actually completed and independently verified, I agreed to restore full easement access for the community pool's legitimate water line, having made my point considerably more effectively, I think, through 11 days of an empty community pool than any lawsuit alone could have accomplished. I want to tell you what happened to Priscilla afterward, because the community's reaction, once the full story became known, particularly the detail that the entire 11-day pool closure had stemmed directly from her decision to steal water from a neighbor's private pool rather than properly budget for a straightforward leak repair, was not kind to her politically. A special meeting was called within weeks, and the vote to remove her from the board was overwhelming, with several residents specifically citing the sheer embarrassment of an entire community losing pool access for nearly 2 weeks because their board president had decided theft was more convenient than a routine maintenance expense. I want to tell you about the day the community pool finally reopened, properly repaired, fully refilled through its own legitimate water access, because I remember standing near the fence line separating my property from the amenity area, watching families finally return to a pool that had sat empty for the better part of 2 weeks, and feeling, honestly, a strange mixture of vindication and genuine relief that the underlying problem, the leak itself, had finally actually gotten fixed, rather than simply patched over with borrowed water from wherever the board could find it. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Desmond said to me during one of our early meetings, reviewing that old easement document for what felt like the 10th time. He said that HOA boards often treat the physical infrastructure running through and around a community as though it exists in some kind of undifferentiated shared space, forgetting that easements, water lines, and shared access rights are actual legal instruments with specific terms and conditions attached, terms that most residents, including the board members themselves, rarely bother to actually read until a dispute forces someone to dig them up. The moment someone does dig them up and discovers that a supposedly informal, assumed authority is actually bound by written, conditional terms, the entire calculation shifts considerably faster than the person who assumed nobody would ever check. We checked, and it turns out that one old utility easement, filed away in the county records since the day Ridgemont Hollow was first platted, one water utility consumption log that made an impossible 2-week absence impossible to explain away, and 11 days without a working community pool were more than enough to make sure Priscilla Wexler-Rashcombe never again decided that someone else's water was simply hers to take. Thumbnail text. She stole my pool water, so I cut hers.